Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is Jake Smeester, Creative Content Specialist for AWS and Amazon Sumerian. And I'm joined today by Chris Schultz, a Solutions Architect Specialist for AR and VR. Is that the correct term?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Chris is here to talk about and walk us through how to create a web-based AR application in just a couple minutes. It's actually really easy and really simple using Amazon Sumerian and also Eighth Wall. One of our friends over at Eighth Wall have created, well, you'll talk more about it, but what Eighth Wall is, but a platform that allows you to create web-based applications. Very, very cool stuff. We're excited to be in this studio. This is a very cool studio, our first time streaming from here. And yeah, so we have a really great show and demo planned for you. Let's see, one of the things we want to talk about, what are we going to cover in this demo? Like, what are we going to look at today?
Yeah, so Jake mentioned that this is focused on web-based AR. So one of the things that I've encountered when working with customers is that it's always been a little more complicated and involved to start a new web AR project. And so I wanted to come up with a way to really streamline that. Mm-hmm. So the folks at Eighth Wall have an article about how to start a Sumerian and Eighth Wall project. We have our own articles that we posted in the past about doing the same, and they were always a little bit complex and involved. So I wanted to come up with an easier solution that really lets you hit the ground running. So probably we should start by giving a demo of what the end result is. Cool, yeah. So then we can dive in and show how it was done.
And one note, like I'm monitoring the chat room right here, and Christoph 8W is from Eighth Wall, so welcome, Christoph. Thank you for joining us. So he might be answering some questions that we maybe don't have the answers for. So there's lots of people from Eighth Wall. Love them over there. Excited to have them too. So, all right, let's get started. Let's switch over to your iPad.
We'll switch over to the computer here. So I've got my iPad mirrored to the computer so everyone can see it. I'm just going to launch the regular Safari web browser on the iPad. And I'm going to reload my scene here so you see it from the start. So the first thing it's going to do is prompt for access to the camera. So I'll allow that. And then immediately we get a 3D model, which I chose ahead of time. And as I move the camera and the iPad, it slides that model across the surface, the floor in this case, that it's detected. So it moves it around aligned with that surface. I can rotate the iPad and you see even the plane is always facing the camera. And you can even see like the reflections, the subtle changes in the reflections on the cowl of the plane as I move it. So I just tap to lock it in place. And now I can inspect the plane from any angle, walk around it, move around it. So it's all the basic stuff you would need for any augmented reality idea you want to build. I just wanted to give you the starting point where you can really get rid of any of that undifferentiated heavy lifting that was previously required with Eighth Wall.
Right. And so in this episode, we're really going to be focusing on not creating a lot of the interactions. This is a multi-part series, by the way. And so this is not the only time we're going to be talking about this. This is just the introduction to using AR with AWS, Amazon Sumerian, Eighth Wall. And so right now we're just really talking about how do you get your object into an AR augmented reality environment or application, right? And so one thing to talk about is this plane. Like, what is this plane? Where does it come from? You found it on Sketchfab.
Yeah.
I actually have a link. I'm going to post that in the chat. So it's free, available to download. It has what's the Creative Commons attribution license. Anyway, so yeah, big props to Law on Sketchfab for providing this model. We're also in the article. We wrote an article. You wrote an article and a tutorial on that. We're really going to be walking through that is actually. Due to my lack of expertise in Git, is in the process of being published. So hopefully by the end of this stream, we're going to actually have that available. So we'll also post that URL in the chat. So I guess one quick question is why this airplane? Is that important to talk about?
It's not particularly important. I just wanted to choose a model that had some complexity to it. And also had enough visual detail that I could show how you make it look like it's really a part of the real world. So the model worked great. We may do some things with the same model in the future to expand on this series that you mentioned. But it was just an interesting model, generously made free on Sketchfab.
Right. And also, as a do, you did go on, and this is we're going to look at in the future too, is and discuss a little bit later on, but not in this episode, but how to actually create like a game using this plane. And so that's what we're looking at for future streams. I did post the URL for this model in the chat. And so again, big thanks to that. Anybody who wants to download it, you're free to do so. Okay. So we've done the demo. Let's talk about eighth wall. What is eighth wall, and why is it important? Let's talk about. Can you answer that question?
Yeah. So this approach requires or combines two different things. It combines Amazon Sumerian and eighth wall. So what Amazon Sumerian gives you is it provides the way to do the interaction in your scene, and it provides the rendering, the 3D rendering in real time. But because browsers do not yet support AR directly in the browser, you need some sort of additional library that does the AR environment tracking for you. So we have a lot of customers who are using eighth wall. The guys at eighth wall have been really great and are friends of ours. So I wanted, since that was a pretty common combination, I wanted to use eighth wall as the tracking library to power my Sumerian experience.
Yeah, so great product. Great stuff they have over there. And so, again, it's eighthwall.com. You can check them out. It actually is a requirement to sign up to complete this demo. You'll need to go to eighth wall, create a developer account, which is free to use. We're using a developer account, and you can use that to combine it and integrate it with your Sumerian scene. Okay, tutorial. That is, again, in the works. I'll provide that shortly, so stand by. All right, let's talk about real quickly before we really dive into this is what makes web browser or web-based augmented reality apps so difficult.
Yeah, so on the plus side, the reason that AR on the web is so appealing is we want that ease of distribution, right? We want the one-click publishing that Sumerian gives you and the ease of getting your experiences that you're building in front of your users. So that's what makes web AR so great. The challenge right now, as I mentioned, is just that the standards, the web standards that will make AR possible in the future in the browser in a very integrated way, haven't advanced enough yet so that they're baked into the browser. So that's why we use things like eighth wall to kind of bridge that gap.
Right. And one of the things to think about is like we have a lot of customers interested in using it for like media and entertainment and advertising and promotional things. And so if you're trying to advertise, whether it's an event or a product of some kind, and you say to a customer, hey, do you want to use this augmented reality experience? Go ahead and download this app. That's a pretty big blocker right there. People are like, I'm not going to check out a promotional thing in AR by downloading. I mean, some might do that, but a lot of people are like, no, thanks. But if they can pull it up in their browser, that opens up a world of opportunities. And so that's why web-based AR is like so special and so important, because it allows you to do things and it lowers the barrier of entry for end users that want to just kind of quickly dive into that experience without having a lot of, downloading an app and, signing credentials and that sort of thing. Okay, so we talked about what is eighth wall, what is eighth wall doing that is unique and special. I feel like we've covered that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's dive into the demo, I guess. We can switch over to your screen.
Yeah, we'll switch over to the screen here. So what I'm going to walk you through is the same steps that you'll find in this article, this tutorial that Jake mentioned. So just know that you don't have to remember it all now. You'll be able to revisit it in the article. But I just want to show you how easy it is to get this up and running. So I'm already logged into my developer account on eighth wall. Again, the developer account is free, so I encourage anyone to sign up. I don't have any eighth wall projects started now. So that's the first thing I need to do. I need to start a new project in the eighth wall dashboard. So I'll go ahead and start it. I'll give it a name. We'll just call this Sumerian Twitch demo. And we'll create that. The first thing I need to do when you're in developer mode with eighth wall, you'll want to test on your actual AR device. So I've got an iPad with me, which I'll be using as my test device. The first thing I need to do is authorize that device to access any apps that I'm building that use eighth wall. So you do that from the device authorization button right here, and it pops up a handy QR code for me to scan. So I will move this over here just so we can kind of see all these at the same time. So on the iPad or any iOS device, the easiest way to scan a QR code is just to open the regular camera. So I'm going to point the camera at the QR code, and then I will launch that, that QR URL in the browser. So that's all I needed to do to authorize this iPad as a test device. So I can close that window now, and we can go back to our browser. So there's only one more thing I need to do in the 8th wall portal here. And that is go to the little cog icon, the settings icon for this particular application. And I need to grab my app key. So I'm just going to copy that to my clipboard, and we'll use that in a moment.
Question about the device authentication. Like why is it important to be able to authenticate a device?
Yeah, so while you're developing your application, it won't be available to the public to access. So you need some way to say that there's a certain number of devices or a certain set of devices that is okay to hit your app while it's in development. And you can authorize as many devices as you want to serve as test devices for your 8th wall content.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So yeah, you would just typically set up your own personal devices or your team's devices or your QA team or whoever's helping you test the application.
And anybody, the two 8th wall people, Rigel and Christoph, if you want to add anything there in the chat room, please correct anything that we may have said that is not correct. So go ahead and add. And if anybody has any questions specific to 8th wall, again, join the chat and ask any questions there, because our friends there are there to field any questions you might have.
So if you've looked at any of our previous articles about combining 8th wall and Sumerian, part of the reason that they were a little complex and a little took some time to complete was because they required you to host your Sumerian content as a private scene and then embed it in a web application using AWS Amplify. And AWS Amplify is an amazing tool. It's a great tool, but it does add its own complexity and has its own learning curve. And that was really what was slowing a lot of people down. So the solution that I'm going to show you eliminates the need to use AWS Amplify, and you can use everything just in the regular Sumerian editor and publish as a public URL like you would any other Sumerian scene. So we'll do the Sumerian piece next. I'm just going to switch over to my AWS console and access Amazon Sumerian. And we're going to create a brand new scene here using the empty templates. We want a complete blank slate to start from. So I will call this Sumerian Twitch demo.
And if you're somewhat familiar or not familiar with Sumerian, one thing to note is that we have a lot of documentation on how to get started. So some of the things, we're not going to be going through a full UI overview of Sumerian for this demo. There's a ton of documentation that we have out there. A lot of former streams and Twitch streams and YouTube videos. We have our own YouTube channel. There's like somewhere over the number of I was just counting the other day, like over 200 pieces of content, both written and video. So there's lots and lots of stuff to just get started. Also working on a video course to get very early beginners jumping in right away. So we're not going to cover all the basics of Sumerian, but so some of this stuff will be moving kind of quickly in terms of the basics.
Yeah. So what I've provided, and here you can see the article that we're about to post, what I provided to really get you started quickly is what we call a Sumerian bundle. It's basically, you can think of it almost like a template that you can import into your scene. So in this article, you'll see a link where you can download this particular bundle. And it's just a regular zip file that's specially formatted so Sumerian knows what to do with it. So in my Sumerian scene, in the assets panel, I'm just going to click on the folder icon to import that scene bundle.
And the unextracted or unzipped. You don't need to extract it or unzip it.
You don't need to unzip it.
Leave it as it is.
So it'll take just about 5 seconds to do the import, and you'll notice that what it did is it sort of populated my entities panel with all the things that it needs to work. So you can see that plane model in my scene. And there's just a few steps we need to go through to make this a live working augmented reality app. So the first step is to select this scenes scripts AR entity. So this is just an empty entity that I've used to attach a few scripts to. And the very first script you see there is one called eighth wall init. And I'm going to paste that app key that I copied in the previous step from the eighth wall website. That's all I need to do. It now has all the information it needs to load the eighth wall SDK into my project. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this extra camera, which is labeled delete me. That just came in as part of the import. So I'll get rid of that.
And the reason for that is because Sumerian by default always has a default camera. And so it's going to bring in a camera. It has to have a camera in a scene. So you opened up an empty scene that has a camera, and then you brought in another scene that has a camera. We don't need two cameras, so you just got to delete one, and we've just made it easy to delete the delete me camera.
Yep. So now we select that default camera, which was already in your scene, and we just need to make a couple small adjustments to it. So the first thing I need to do is turn off the follow editor camera option. So now I can set the camera's position independent of where I happen to be looking in the viewport here. So with that camera selected, I'm just going to set its position to X0, Y 1.5, and Z0. The X and Z values actually aren't that important for eighth wall. Let me go ahead and bring in the background so you can see it a little better. But the Y position is important. So the Y is the height of the camera. And with eighth wall, the Y position of your camera is what determines the scale this object will be when you add it to the real world. So I want the plane to look like it's a smaller model. So I'm putting the camera up about twice as high as the height of the model itself.
So if you wanted it to be a bigger, so we're trying to make it like a toy plane that can go on
Yes.
the table or something. If you wanted to make it like a life-size plane,
you'd bring the camera down to wherever the person's eye would come on the plane
Gotcha.
in the real world to set that scale.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so that's really all I need to do. Those two steps, the adding the eighth wall app key and the setting the position of the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and make the background transparent again and then publish this scene. So I'm going to create a public link.
And to clarify, you don't need to change the background, like opacity at all. We were just doing that just so you could see it more easily.
Oh yeah, I just made the background visible so you could see it better. You do need the background to be transparent for AR. So we'll publish that. It'll take just a couple seconds here. And then typically at this point in my regular workflow, I would take this URL and create a short URL of it using bit.ly or tiny URLs so that I can easily type it on my iPad. But for expediency here, I have installed this browser extension that just lets me display any URL as a QR code. So I'm going to use that as my way to get our URL loaded up. So I'll point it there. Then I'm going to go full screen with this, and I will launch it into Safari now. And the first time you run this, you'll probably get this message, which asks for access to the motion sensors on your device. So you'll just click continue. Then it will prompt for the actual motion sensor access and the camera access, which you need for all augmented reality applications. And there we go. We're back to that example I showed you earlier. So you'll notice there's a user interface prompt at the bottom of the screen that says, tap the screen to lock the object in place. That's a piece of functionality that I just built into this scene for you because you want to be able to give your users some clear instruction about what they need to do. And then when I tap, that message goes away and the plane is now locked in place. So that's
That's
really
cool.
all
That is
there
cool.
is to it. That was maybe 5 minutes or less of work to get a working AR application launched to the world. So that's the basics of how you would build this. Do we want to go in and show a little bit about how the scene actually works, or what would you
Sure.
like to do next?
Well, one thing I wanted to ask though is that could you actually pull up if you can show
Yeah.
the plane again?
Yeah.
Because this is one thing. There's like some artistic stuff to like consider, and so even in the development of this tutorial that we've been talking about, is that like what should the shadow look like? And so as you can tell, there is a little bit of a shadow, and it is part of your Sumerian scene. It's like a transparent quad entity, really,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And we'll take a look at it in a
It's I
moment.
guess translucent, and so something to consider, like when you're trying to style this, is like what shape should that be? And so why did you? And it's really, if you look at it, it's kind of like just a roundish shadow. So when people are looking at how to do this, like what are some things to consider in terms of rendering and scene size when they're trying to bring in additional textures or trying to shade it or trying to have shadows a little more customized?
Yeah, so I can give you some quick tips. There's a whole lot of interesting things you can do to make your stuff look more realistic. What I've tried to do is set you up with a template that gives you some of that stuff just out of the box, so you don't even have to worry about it. But the major things are you do want some sort of shadow of your object. Otherwise, it just doesn't look like it's rooted in place in the physical world. What I'm using here is just a very simple radial gradient image as my shadow, which can work very well for some things. It gives a very soft shadowed look to an object. We don't have a built-in way in Sumerian currently to do real-time shadows on transparent surfaces, which is essentially what your augmented reality surface is. So this approach of using a graphic-based shadow is a good kind of trick to use. The other things I'd say are having good lighting in your scene that matches the environment that your users are most likely to use the thing in, which I can talk a little bit about how I did that in this project. And then reflections are a big one. So you want, even though in my scene has no background image or panorama or anything, but you want it to look as if it's reflecting something. So you can see the reflections are, there's very detailed reflections on this metallic cowl of the plane and even on the side of the plane.
Right.
That goes a long way to selling the realism of it as well.
Totally. And maybe when we jump back into Sumerian, you can actually
Yep.
show, because I believe this is a PBR based model, correct?
Yeah.
And so it's actually the reflections. It's not true reflections. It's actually reflecting an image that is. Imagine like the plane being wrapped around with an image, and it's reflecting that image, but you can't see the image.
Yeah.
Only the plane is showing the reflections of that image.
Well, let's break down the scene, and I can point out like how that's working. So, before I dive in here, the main point of this is you don't have to know how this works. So maybe I should start with that. You don't have to know how this works. You don't have to change any of the code. You don't have to understand how the code works. My goal was to give you a starting point. So let's say you did want to use this as a starting point, but swap in your own model. All you would have to do is under this AR content, you see my airplane there. You would just delete that airplane and add your own model as a child of that AR content. So let's just go ahead and add a cube for now. The only important thing to note, and I'm going to make the background opaque again so it's a little easier to see. The important thing to note is you just want whatever model you put in the scene to look like it's resting on the 0, 0 point, where this grid is, because then it will always align that to whatever surface eighth wall sees in your scene. But as long as you do that, you can easily swap in any model you want, or even a bunch of models positioned in different places. So the two things that are under that AR content entity are the airplane model itself and the main light for my scene. So that light always gets positioned wherever the model gets positioned. So let's take a look at some of the things in the scene. First thing at the top here is just our two-dimensional UI that lays on top of the scene. That's where that message prompt occurs. We already talked a little bit about the eighth wall init script, but there are a couple other scripts that are used to do the actual positioning of your AR content. And what they're actually doing is those scripts are taking this AR content entity, and as the camera moves, it's just sliding that AR content entity to wherever the camera is pointed. So that's what's happening inside the scene. That's why we wanted the plane and the light both to be children of that entity, so that they both move as a group. The surface plane is essentially a flat, invisible object in your scene, which represents whatever surface eighth wall has detected. So if I placed the model on the table, it would represent the surface of the table. If I place it on the floor, it represents the floor. I just used a regular quad entity. The way I made it invisible is by changing the cull face, which is normally set to back so that you actually see something. I just set it to front and back. So it means it basically has neither a front nor back side. So it's essentially invisible. And then I added a collider to it. A collider is an important piece of how that placement works, because we're using the physics engine to kind of understand where the camera is in relation to the surface.
And one thing we had talked about in prep, we were talking yesterday about the stream and what questions we want to field, is that there's a lot of differences. Like, even if you look at some of our tutorials, there's like AR image tracked or image or object anchored. Like, can you talk about kind of like what does it mean to really track a surface, and like what's the difference between like anchoring and image recognition? And
yes,
some of those things are maybe a little bit obvious, but I just for some people, not always for someone like me, I love having it explained. So if you could talk about like what is these differences, what does it mean to actually track a surface, and what are things to consider when you're actually like tracking a surface?
Yeah, so it can be very confusing, and it's even hard when we talk about it internally, coming up with the right terms that will make sense to everyone. So I like to think of it as there being three different types of AR tracking. There's surface tracking or environment tracking, which is the AR system you're using is doing its best to understand the shape of the real world around you, particularly flat horizontal surfaces. So a lot of people became familiar with this when ARKit on iOS and AR Core and Android came out, because for the first time you had these powerful libraries that were able to detect these flat surfaces like tabletops and floors in a real space. So that kind of flat surface tracking is something that's really useful, because then your user has the power to place AR content anywhere that they want to, anywhere that's convenient for them. Another approach is image-based tracking, or sometimes called marker-based tracking, where you have to have a special image that will be recognized by the AR system to kind of give it the orientation it needs. This is a sort of much older AR approach. It's still very effective, but the downside is then your users either have to be able to print out that marker or somehow have access to that image. And then the third and sort of most sophisticated type is object tracking, or 3D object tracking, where you can take a real physical object in the world and have the AR system recognize not only what that object is, but its orientation in space. So eighth wall can provide the first two options. It can provide a certain type of environment tracking or surface tracking and image tracking. So once this article is live, we will have articles covering both of those approaches. So if the case you're doing is better fit for image tracking, we've got you covered there. And we've actually updated that article to use this simpler approach that I just demonstrated for eighth wall integration. And now we've got this environment tracking. So I do want to point out some of the limitations for this surface-based tracking. So I've got a couple of videos that I can show you to show that. So ARKit and AR Core on iOS and Android have gotten really powerful in their surface tracking. So they identify surfaces, they know what the bounds of the surfaces are, and they can detect multiple surfaces in the same physical space. With eighth wall, the surface detection is a little bit more limited. So it only detects essentially a single surface, and it doesn't really know the bounds of it. It just does its best guess for what the immediate surface is. When it works, I want to talk about when that works well and when it doesn't. So I'm first going to show you the case where it doesn't work well. So in order for this approach to the approach that eighth wall is taking to work well, you really need a surface that has some distinguishing features to it. So I discovered in our office that when I try to place something on this wooden table, I'll show you kind of what happens. It looks like it's tracking on the wooden table and very well. And then when I lock it in place and start to move, it almost looks like the plane is sliding across the surface. Well, it's because it didn't actually place it on the table. What it did is it placed it on the floor behind the table. Because there wasn't enough distinct features on that table. For one thing, it's round, so it has no corners to key off of.
Right.
And also the wood grain is very subtle, so it's not enough for the camera to pick up on. Meanwhile, the carpet itself is very detailed and has a lot of features to pick up on. So you can just to show how you can kind of compensate for that is I have another video where I used that same table, but I placed a few things on it, some clutter basically, which was able to give it enough distinct detail. The eighth wall could really lock onto it well. So now when I place the plane and move my phone, it tracks great. So so that's something to be aware of when you're sort of giving users instruction about where to place things. Is you might need to give them some hints about what makes a good surface to place on and what doesn't.
Right. And that's also just has to do with the nature of the, like, we're still in the early phases of like AR, and so like browser-based AR especially, it's like there's a lot trying to be done like in the browser, and so yeah, it's cool though. I mean, like the things that we're seeing now, it's like a year ago, wasn't possible, and now like we're seeing advances like really quickly, and so but while we're kind of still in this like new phase of AR. One thing to think about is that, well, sometimes image-based does make sense because it's like it recognizes this image and it can populate your model and your scene or whatever it is, and it's stuck on that particular image. But people don't always have access to a particular image, and so it really depends on like what your use case is and what your target audience is too. Let's see. So we talked about all these different like surface detection. That's also one thing to comment is that, like, you can see this tabletop here. It's like it's really dark and it doesn't have much definition. So that's one reason why it's like the floor over next to us makes a lot more sense to put it there. So if you're wondering like, why we're putting it over there, not this table in between us. Great. That covers a lot of the. There's been several questions, a good chat in the chat room. One question that we've seen a couple of things is like, how are these tools different than other things, like other tools, like whether it's Adobe products or Spark AR? Like we don't want to get into the business of comparing, but like maybe you can comment on like there's a lot of different tools to develop AR, and like each one is going to have pros, each one's going to have cons. In particular, I haven't used either one of those, so I can't really comment on it. But do you have any comments just on like different AR tools and possible differences and what you can expect?
Yeah, I would say I've got some general comments anyway that I can add to the mix. So I usually describe Sumerian to people as a general purpose development environment for creating any sort of interactive 3D experience. So that means it's not purely focused as a prototyping tool like some of the other AR tools out there. It's not purely focused on one particular use case. And the other thing is it's sort of built on the technologies that web developers typically know, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you already have those skills, it provides you a sort of very comfortable environment to work in. So but the spectrum of tools is broad and growing. So there are some tools that are focused more on people who are non-coders and more on the creative side. There are other tools that are focused where everything is done exclusively through code. Sumerian tries to help people that are both coming from a creative background or a tech background. So state machines,
Kind of like you and I.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
more creative. You're more of a technical.
Yeah, so like state machines is an awesome solution for getting your ideas working without having to learn programming principles or how to program JavaScript specifically. But JavaScript can be a really powerful tool in the hands of a coder. And what's great thing about state machines in particular is you can pair someone who's maybe more of a creative person and someone who's a coder person, and the programmer can write new actions that the creative person can then use in a state machine. So it's really a great collaborative kind of framework too.
And maybe a good comparison is that, I have a video and marketing background, but creative, but so non-development is background. And like for me, when I use different video editing tools, it's like, well, Adobe Premiere is like a really great tool for some things. There's some times when like Camtasia is a great, quick, easier thing for certain projects. And so it depends on like what you're trying to do, and developers and the creatives both alike might use a variety of different tools for different. And again, it's kind of early. It's kind of, I don't know honestly if you would use multiple tools to create an AR, but there's a lot of different options. And so it's certainly, it's cool to see it also developing like this too.
And another thing that is definitely worth pointing out with Sumerian specifically is that it is built to integrate easily with other AWS services.
Yeah, that's
so
a good
a lot of AR, VR, and Web 3D content really benefits from being able to tap into things like a DynamoDB database or natural language processing, with Lex. Some
native integrations that make it a lot
so
easier.
that's another reason that a lot of folks who like the Sumerian approach is because it does let them integrate all these other really powerful services into their experience easily.
Right. And one thing to point out, and this is, I'm glad that Rigel put this in the chat room, Rigel Prime. There's a Sumerian and eighth wall example using Jumanji, who's created for this movie, and so he has the link is posted there. Go check it out. It's a really, really cool experience. So I encourage you, if you're curious to look at something a little bit more interactive, a little bit more a larger experience, go check that one out. It's really cool. It's just at explorejumanji.com, and if you have a mobile device, you can scan the QR code. It'll pop up the scene, and you can interact with it there. So I would encourage you to do that. And let's see.
Can I show one quick thing?
Yes.
So I walked you through this. Everything worked like a charm, but we know in the real world things don't always work perfectly the first time. So there is one thing I want to show iOS users in particular. So let me get my iPad back up here. So if you have set your device up as a test device on eighth wall, and you go to load your scene and you get a message saying that the device isn't authorized, even though you authorized it.
Yeah. I went through this.
Yeah, because this has happened to a couple of people when we were testing too. It's very easy to fix, but it's maybe not super intuitive. So, and there are instructions on the eighth wall website in their documentation in the known issues and workarounds section that will walk you through what I'm about to walk you through. But we'll just take a look here. So what you would need to do in iOS is go to your Safari preferences, and you need to go to the section that is, if I can find it here, prevent cross-site tracking. So because you're loading your Sumerian scene from an Amazon URL, but the eighth wall SDK is being loaded from another URL, the device authorization is using a cookie that eighth wall writes to your browser. And sometimes the logic in iOS that's protecting you from being tracked across the internet, which is this cross-site tracking option, will get in the way of that depending on what call it makes. So you can just turn that off, clear the cache on your browser, and reauthorize your device, and you should be off to the races.
Cool. Yeah, that's something that tripped me up for a while, and then did some digging and Chris discovered a solution. So yeah, and it works. And then it popped up, and I've been able to create a bunch of different scenes using this. Like really, once you get comfortable with this, you can do something like this or create a project, an AR project, literally in like 3 minutes.
Yep.
Once you get comfortable with it, it's pretty wild how easy it is to do. That really covers most of the stuff we're going to talk about today. We have scheduled in 2 weeks. February 4th is the current date. We will make sure to post, in case anything changes, which sometimes scheduling and travel and all that does come up. February 4th is our next planned stream, and what are we going to be talking about there?
So we're going to take this same starter project, but we're going to add some custom functionality to it. So I think what we'll focus on in the next episode is adding some gesture controls. So like the ability to use a pinch gesture to rescale the object for your end users, to rescale the object and rotate it and reposition it, which is a pretty common thing you'll see in AR applications.
Cool. Yeah. And with this tutorial we've mentioned, again, it has to do with human error on my side. But this will be up really by the end of the day or within an hour or so. So we will make sure we post this article in a lot of places. Whether it's like I'll post it on my Twitter feed, you'll post it on your Twitter feed. I'm sure we'll post it in our Slack channel. Would you mind also just going to the non-preview of our documentation site? So if you have any questions, you can contact us on Slack. And so if you're new to this stream, or if you're new to Sumerian, you're new to AWS even, you can go to this documentation site. I don't know if it's not I guess it will take you there. Tutorials and articles. Over there, and there it is. This is our community site. And you see there's a link to join Slack, and there's also our YouTube channel. So this video will be posted as a playlist later on the YouTube channel. And then, you can join Slack. You can ask us questions. Both of Chris and I are on there. So you can ask us questions. When we follow up, we'll post things like new articles and new updates and things like that. So join our community. Really cool stuff. Lots of people are doing really great things. The Eighth Wall people are also in there too, so you can ask them questions directly. So really, really cool environment, really, really cool community that you can join. Stay tuned for this article. This will be coming out really soon. We're excited about it. We're excited about the continuation of this series and learning AR, Amazon Sumerian, Eighth Wall, really cool stuff. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Jake.
For putting this all together. It's a lot of work. And so appreciate just all the work you did to make our customers, make it easier for them to be able to create AR experiences. All right. Again, any questions, find us on Slack, ask us there, find us there, and we can talk later. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Here we go.